Hi, I'm Mrs. Strat, and I'm here to help you analyse the main character of The Secret River by Kate Grenville. William Thornhill, he's the protagonist, and we're going to just spend some time getting into a real deep understanding of who he is. We're going to look at some potential theses based on just analysing his character, and then we're going to go through and kind of look at what Kate Grenville, who wrote another book called Searching for the Secret River, where she just outlines how she created her characters, looking at what motivated her, and it just helps us get a bit of insight into how she sees Thornhill and what she believes about him, so that we can better broaden our understanding of who he is. And then we're just going to tie some quotes in to kind of showcase how we could analyze him and what quotes we could use to prove our point, because remembering that we always want a pattern of examples. I really like that phrase, because one event is just one event. It could just be an anomaly in the book. But if you can show, oh, well, this happened and this happened and this happened, oh, wow, that becomes a pattern. And I start to, as the marker, I go, oh, yes, you understand this. This is actually something that's real in the novel, and we can prove it through multiple points. So let's get started. Okay. So to start with, if we were looking at the question, how is the reader positioned to view Thornhill, there's a few different ways in which we could look at it. We could look at him as a victim of his past who perpetuates the cycle of injustice. So we know that he had a terrible childhood. We learn through the novel that he was poor, and slowly through, connections with family friends, he's able to build his way up a little bit. But in his social structure, which is the nice little pyramid that we see, we have, the king at the top, then we have the gentry or the nobles, lords and nobles and ton, as well as the middle class citizens, and then lower class, and then the poor. And he's kind of in the poor section. And so his ability to move up through that is seen in his ability to perpetuate the cycle of injustice. So he doesn't try to break it and say, this system's faulty, my class system that pushes people down and perpetuates them in a cycle of poverty so that the only way they can survive is through crime. He doesn't really go into that. He just goes, hey, this is the system, let me work it for myself. And so in doing so, he pushes others down into poverty cycles or into below disrespectful positions so that he can be on top. And part of that could be because, you could argue, is because of what he went through as a child and as a teen, and in shaping him in his values and beliefs. So that's one way you could look at it. You could also look at him as a confused lower class convict who selfishly seeks security and respect through ownership. So he's kind of confused as to what he should do and how he should go about it, but he knows what he wants. He wants security and respect, and he thinks he can get it through ownership. By owning something, they can't take that away from me. They took away from me in London because we didn't own it. That was the problem. But if I own this land, then I will have respect and I'll have security and everything will go all right. But he doesn't know the best way to go about that, so he's slightly confused about it. That's another way you could look at him. Or you could look at him as a man who seems respectable, but eventually causes the reader to despise him due to his morally ambivalent actions. So, ambivalent actions. Now, I really like this phrase, morally ambivalent actions, because ambivalent is kind of this idea of having two contradictory ideas. And so he really does have his morals that are contradictory for himself. As he goes through it, he is kind of like, do I treat them as humans, the Daruk people who live here, or do I treat them as like vermin? Do I respect them or do I annihilate them? And so he's kind of like tossed and turning between these two morally polar opposite ideas, and he's not quite sure what he should do. And because he is morally ambivalent, because he doesn't have that strength of character to say, no, this is right and I'm going to follow the right way, the reader eventually does disconnect with him, even though we kind of understand, even though we kind of go, yeah, I get it. We do eventually kind of go, you're not the man you were meant to be. Like, you could have been the leader of this system, but instead you're just you're just a man. And we do eventually kind of reject him for his choices in the end. But let's have a look at what Kate Grenville can say to add to this conversation. So according to Kate Grenville, part of her process in thinking of the plot, of how she wanted it to go, is she's thinking about his interactions with the Aboriginal people. So he begins thinking about the Aboriginal people in one way, then he goes through several shifts of attitude and ends up joining an attack against them. So we see that this becomes the tension point of how is he going to reconcile with the Aboriginal people there? Is he going to reconcile with them? And if not, how is that going to work out for him? So she then goes on to say that the plot tension focused on choices, his choices. And the choices were how to be in the country he'd come to. And that's part of it with the land itself, with the other white settlers of the place, but also with the original inhabitants. How is he going to be with them? And this is a bit where I can say, as a personal note, that I feel she puts some ideas in place of how to be, but it really is a retelling of the dark history of Australia. So that whole idea of how we just got it wrong. We did not do it justice. And I don't know if there was a way to do it with justice. I guess it is okay for us to question the morals and the motives of the people at the time, and kind of look at what we can do in the future, which I think is the essence of what Grenville's trying to do, is how does this help us in the future now? But let's have a look a bit more at how we look at these choices, especially in regards to how Thornhill's attitude changes throughout his time in relation to Aboriginal people. So the first little mini chapter that we get is him meeting for the first time an Aboriginal man that just appears out of the darkness. So he's in a foreign land, he's come to serve his sentence, and all of a sudden there's a man as dark as dark. Now, according to Grenville, she would have said that he's, having lived on the docks and worked there, he would have met a whole lot of people from different cultures. So it's not like it's his first time. But to him, it was the spear. So the spear was tall and serious, to have evaded death at the end of a rope, only to go like this, his skin punctured and blood spilled beneath the chilly stars. So here we see the way in which he is scared of the vulnerability. They are powerful men with spears and seriousness, and he doesn't know if he can trust them, and he doesn't know how to interact with them, and they don't speak the same language, they don't understand each other. So his first interaction, the first attitude that he gets is fear, protect. And so when we have fear at the heart of it, it is it is basically his consistent thread. Even though his attitude shifts and changes, he is always afraid of them. He is always uncertain and unclear of, am I going to die because of these people? And so that kind of does negate his ability to reconcile or interact in a positive way with them, to find a sense of connectedness rather than separateness. So as he goes on, we see that he lives there for a little bit, and this is his perception of ownership. So he goes, the blacks, there were no signs that the blacks felt the place belonged to them. They had no fences, this is mine. No houses that said, this is our home. There were no fields or flocks that said, we've put labor of our hands into this place. So in his perception, his initial perception, he's saying, the blacks don't own this place. There is no sense that they really understand what ownership is according to my culture. So his culture, and you have to think from London, everything is built up. Everything has buildings and fences and this and that. So he really does go here and everything's just wild. It looks wild to him. So he thinks they don't really own this place. And I guess in some instance, they don't own the place. They are connected to this place. And we see that as the end. And I'll get to that. We'll have a little pin to remember. about that. But he then also, he finally gets to own Thornhill Point. Well, not own, but he tries to claim it. And the men are there. This is his first real interaction with them, where they're trying to communicate beyond just acknowledging of each other. And he bends down with a twig and drew on the marks on the dust a curving line, the river and the tidy square representing his own 100 acres. This is mine, Thornhill's place. So we see here he's trying to lay claim. He's trying to communicate to them with pictures and say, this is mine. But he's really naive. He really doesn't seem to understand that they already were here. This is already their land. And so he naively thinks, well, I've turned up here, I've put up a house and I've put some corn in to grow. So now it's mine, move on. Because if you really think of it, he kind of does go on to say, you can have everywhere else, this is my land. But if everyone's doing that, if all of these white people are coming over and saying, this is my land, go elsewhere, go elsewhere, go elsewhere, where else can they go? There is no thought of that. And there's no real understanding of this is theirs. He is taking something from them. So, and I guess you could talk about the irony of how he goes from stealing from the gentry to stealing from the Darug people. And he is still a thief at heart. Okay, and if we go to the next one, I just wanted to highlight how he sees Whisker Harry. So Whisker Harry is the leader, the powerful chief of the Darug people on his land. And he stalks about on skinny shanks and hurried deliberate, or he might stand 1 foot wedged against the other knee, his spear upright beside him, watching the distance. And when he came face to face with Thornhill, he looked through him as if he were made of air. Now, I find this an interesting thing because it feels a lot like Whisker Harry is treating Thornhill as the gentry treated him. And so there's this nice sort of comparison or juxtapositioning of similar sort of ideas coming in here, where Whisker Harry looks through him, but with a different sort of perception of, not in the sense of you're beneath me, but in the sense of you're irrelevant to me, you are nothing. Whereas the gentry, it's like they needed him to some degree. He was rowing their boats, he was doing things for them. So they looked through him in a sense of, you are beneath me, but I do need your services, sort of thing. We are part of a society together. You are the irrelevant part, but I am the more needed. Whereas Whisker Harry, it just seems like he's there, he's doing his thing, and William could be there or not there. There is no need, but there's a similar sort of reservedness or sense of disrespect in how he's treating him. But then we go on and he further interacts with the Darug people of his land. And, there's this one instance where they're having a chat and he looks at his son, Dick really does connect with the Indigenous people on the land. They play together. He really finds them fascinating and wants to learn from them, wants to be a part of that culture. But William finally stands there and he looks and goes, with no one around but blacks around him and other than his own son, Thornhill saw that their skins were not black. No, though more than his was white. They were simply skins, with the same paws and hairs, the same shadings of colour as his own. If black skin was all there was to see, it was amazing how quickly it became the colour that skin was. So here we see his understanding that there aren't really difference because of colour. The colour of the skin is not what makes them different. And he's starting to see a little bit of, in this moment, his shifting attitude. So he goes from not liking to fear to we are very similar. And he flows in and out of that, even within the same scene. So within this scene, he's kind of saying like the blacks are the same as me. But then literally the next breath on the next page, he's saying they're like children. They are ignorant, unaware that we are going to wipe them out. And they are more naive than my baby daughter. So he really has this shifting attitude of not really sure of what to think. And so let's go back to Grenville and see what she says. So in terms of how she describes him, she sees him as a quick-tempered, and she injected him with a quick temper and a tendency towards violence, a cold-blooded determination. So he's very determined, and we see that, and we'll go through some quotes that show that. But he was also conscious of the humiliation by the gentry, and had a rough and ready sense of justice and charity. So he really was aware of the mistreatment he experienced. And we see that to start with in his name. Now, the insecurity that he has in the fact that his name is as common as dirt. Like his sister says that your name is as common as dirt, William Thornhill. And it pierces his insecurity, his sense of being, because he feels like he has no place in this world. He is nothing. He's insignificant. And that insignificance is further instilled in him in how the gentry treat him and how those even slightly above him treat him. And so he's trying to work himself out. And even when he does own land and he does get position of power and he has enough money to own convicts, he meets the man, the captain who took him here, and he's like, oh, I don't forget a face, you're William Thornhill, the felon. And so we see this humiliation again of he has to wait to the last to pick last, because he is not the high-class citizen. He is the felon still. So it was an old pain returning to find that William Thornhill, felon, was waiting under the skin of William Thornhill, landowner. And so we see this whole insecurity that comes up again and again of I need respect, I need power, because otherwise I'm nothing. And we then go on to see his sense of violence. And we see that in how he treats his kids. Like Dick, at one stage, he doesn't like the fact that he interacts with so much with the dark people on the land. And one time Dick's caught being naked, playing with the kids naked, and his wife tries to just gently say, Dick, we need to wear clothes, it's not appropriate, we're civilized, we wear clothes, whereas William just goes, nah, he needs a belting. So he belts him one. But within that, you can also see the sense of his justice and fairness, because he realizes the next day when he goes to talk to Dick, and Dick's still a bit belligerent, going, no, you can't do anything. William stops and goes, I'm not going to beat you again, because he's like, if beating him once did not do the trick, beating him twice would not do any better. He'd learned that much on board the Alexander. So he's realizing that, on reflection, violence isn't always the way, but he is so quick-tempered, and we see that in how he goes to interact with the Indigenous people who come on his land in the first few days, and they try to take his things, and he's not sure what he's going to do. His boys are there telling him, "Come on, Dad, they're taking our stuff," and he's like, what do I do? And you see here, he had no plan, but found that he had pushed at the man's shoulder. It was warm and muscular. He slapped it lightly, and when he had slapped it once, it seemed easy to go on doing it. So you see that he's just got this sense of violence that he can't control, and it's his first go-to of, I'm going to hit them, I'm going to push them, I'm going to show my strength before he thinks. But then we also see his cold determination, and this is interesting because we can develop it a bit further, but his first moment that he lets himself imagine it, standing on the crest of that slope, looking down over his own place, Thornhill Point. It was a piercing hunger in his guts to own it, to say mine in a way he'd never been able to say mine of anything at all. So here we see this cold determination. He is going to own this place. We know it. We can see it, and he does. He steps it through. He manipulates his wife to some degree just so that he can own that land, and he steals it to get it, basically. And then it's the choices he makes to keep it, and that's an interesting thing. And I'd like to point out this beautiful metaphor that Grenville uses, a piercing hunger in his guts to own it, because it likens it to a need. We know he was a starving boy. We know he knows what it's like to be not so hungry you imagine food, sort of thing. He has had that experience, and this piercing hunger makes it a need, because hunger is a need. You can't survive without it. And so she's using this metaphor to liken it to starvation. Without it, he will die. Without this land, he is not going to exist anymore. And so it's a nice sort of connection back to his unjust life at the beginning, to show how he's come so far, that now that his belly's full, it's something else that fills him as a hunger that he needs. So going back to Grenville and what she says. So one of the things that we do notice is he has a deep love for his wife and children. It's not always expressed beautifully or perfectly, but we do see this softer side of him. And because we see that softer side, the violence he inflicts on the Aboriginal people takes on a different quality. To some degree, I think that can be true. We do question it because we do see this ambivalent morality in him. We see this like softer side, this human side of realizing that the Darug people are human, of realizing that there's no real difference between him. But then we also see this contrasting side of pure evil, where he just follows the smasher perception of let's kill, let's decimate. And he just doesn't know quite how to reconcile the two, how to be strong enough to be the man that is rational and aware of the humanity of all people, versus the man who just wants what he wants and he'd do anything to get it. So we go through and we see the quotes here of, like, you know, often we see throughout the novel his wife just cuddling together, that sort of softness of the smart in his palm and this other smart, the one somewhere in his heart, was soon soothed by the feel of his wife's body in his arms, her breath in his ear. So there is a sense that his wife is kind of the calmer, the mothering type who just relaxes him and helps him to deal with his conflicted morality, his conflicted emotions. He doesn't actually ever understand them, but he knows that she can help combat that. But it's interesting because I want to go back to what I said before about how he manipulates her. Because, you know, he says, oh, it's just 5 years, Dove. It's just 5 years, Sal. Just 5 years. And I think that's the beginning of his sort of lying. He's trying to manipulate her. He's trying to say, no, this is where we're going to live and I want it so bad. And then we see here the unspoken between them was that she was a prisoner here, marking off the days of her little round of beating earth. And it was unspoken because she did not want him to feel like a jailer. So she did feel like a prisoner. She did feel like he was doing this, and she kind of half knew, as we see it later on when she tries to negotiate with him and tries to say, okay, well, if we're not going to leave here because of the Aboriginal people, let's like to go to London, because that's her dream, London. But if we're not going there, can we at least go back to Sydney and start, like, be somewhere safe? This is not a safe place. And so we see this contrasting view of him, his ambivalent morality again, where he loves her, but not enough to let go of his land. And so there we see something of his character. And according to Grenville, he's a man who didn't do bad, or wasn't altogether bad, but did bad things, and therefore could feel remorse. Even though he's unable to reconcile between his beliefs and actions, he knew something wasn't right. And so at the end, we do see his sort of unable to appreciate what he's got, and he's not sure why. But I don't know whether it quite makes us empathize fully with him. I think we are still a little revolted by his participation, his capitulation into that sort of negative perspective of killing people to get what he wants. And so we see also that he doesn't see that he might have accepted that black people were not quite human savages. So that's the perception he gets from culture, the cultural assumptions of Aboriginal people are savages, they're evil, they're vermin, we have to kill them. But then on the other hand, because he was inferior in his own class, he may have been able to be a bit more sympathetic. And we see that in how he tries to reach out to Blackwood and say, look, you interact with them differently. What is different about what you're doing? And he might have realized that difference didn't mean inferiority. He might have realised that, but he certainly didn't show a lot of it. According to Grenville as well. So the idea is for her was that when he came in contact with the Aboriginal people, his response was complex. His attitude wasn't fixed, arrived at by education and thought. So Smasher is a perfect example of a fixed mindset. He was like, they are evil, they are vermin, they are deserving of death, and I will kill them. Whereas Will is in that flux, that sense of up and down, I'm not sure what to think, I'm not sure how to interact with them. And it is driven by day-to-day events. There's this fluid belief of what they do is how I'm going to respond, not my choice of how I'm going to interact with them. And so this is the interesting thing, and this is what I think we can really get from this, is that it's something personal that tips the balance. He doesn't go and annihilate participate in the massacre because he hates them. He doesn't do it because he wants to dominate over them. He does it because he wants something personal. It's very personal for him. Now, according to Grenville, it's that his love for his wife or family. I'm not so sure that she was able to fully show it as his wife, and he did it because of his wife. I think he did it because of his land. He really wanted his land. And I'll go through and prove that a little bit as we go through. So if we come here, we can see the land. To him, it was a place of promise, the blank page on which a man might write a new life. So it's a new page for him. It's a new story. He gets to take his old life of trauma and starvation and poverty and rewrite it. And that to him is the beauty, the symbolism of his land, the symbol of freedom, of newness. And that's, I think, a really powerful tool to see. So when you're talking about the land, always use it as a symbol of how William saw it as a symbol of his ability for freedom, for a new life. But then we see how he talks to Blackwood, and I think this is where it becomes hard, his ambivalence, because Blackwood never gives him an answer that makes sense, an answer that's beyond basic. Like he talks about give a little, take a little. What did that mean when it came right down to it? Not just words, but an act in time and place. So how do you give a little, take a little? Like, is it just trade? Is Blackwood really just saying like give a little flour, take a little land, it's okay? Or is Blackwood trying to say, no, it's about give a little, take a little culture. Like you give your culture, you take some of their culture and you find a happy medium. And that's where William, he's too black and white. He doesn't understand the nuances of this phrase. And he asks again because he goes to Blackwood again and says, give a little, take a little. And that's all he gets. But the mechanics of that was still vague, unless it meant laying in good supply of hats, because the story that Blackwood shares is that you're meant to get a hat. Well, no, he gave them a hat and they took it. But it's a really, really vague sort of idea. And to some degree, I understand why Thornhill never went with it, because it never made sense. It was never clear enough to say, what you have to do is you have to find a way to trust them, and you have to find a way to show that they can trust you. And part of that is going to be working together as neighbours and accepting that they're going to be there and how you're going to deal with that. But, Blackwood doesn't show that. And also Blackwood's connection is that he actually learns the language, he gets a wife, and William's like, I'm not going to go to that much effort. I've already got a wife. Why would I do that? So it's really difficult for him to take on the values of Blackwood. It's really difficult for him to understand the values of Blackwood, because at a very superficial level, I don't think anyone can say that a little bit of flour is worth 100 acres of land. That's not fair. That's not real. And they don't even understand. They're not even speaking the same language. So this whole give a little, take a little is too ambiguous. It needed to be fleshed out for people like Thornhill to really understand of this is how you work through it. And we see that with how, they were willing to some of the neighbours were willing to let the Aboriginal people take from their land, just take a little bit that they've grown, and others were like Smasher and Saggity, they'd kill them if they even thought of doing it. So here we see the moral ambivalence of William, where he's like, I want to do right, but I don't know what right is, and more importantly, it's too hard. I'm feeling fear. I'm scared for my family. And we go down into Smasher judging Thornhill for his peaceful interaction with the dog people. So he's gone to Blackwood, he's tried to do this peaceful interaction, and then Smasher's like saying, I know what you're doing, I know what you and Blackwood are doing, you better be careful. And so then he goes, but he felt a kind of panic. He had stepped on a great wheel that was spinning away somewhere that he'd never planned to go. So suddenly he's afraid of what other people on the thing are saying about him. So there's this pressure of respect as well, social standing, that he's not sure of how to deal with. So it's all eating away at his morality. And then we also see here his further step into the evilness, the side where we go, who are you? I don't know if I can read anymore because you are not a man I respect. When he is tempted by Smasher offering him this sex slave that he's got chained up. And I'm sure all women who've read this, I would hope, are thinking, how could you even be tempted by a woman who's chained up and bruised and bleeding? How can you not feel compassion for her and want to help her? But then here is also a sign of secrets. I think it's an interesting thing that violence is always associated with secrets in the novel. So when he sees this, he goes, I'm not going to tell Sal, because he wants to hide the shame, he wants to hide the fear, and he wants to hide that violence from her. And so we thinking the thoughts, saying the words would make him the same as Smasher, as if Smasher's mind had got into his when he saw the woman in the hut and felt that instant of temptation. He had done nothing to help her. Now the evil was a part of him. And I think it's nice that he acknowledges he'd done nothing to help her, but he always had a moment to stop and go, I'm going to go help her. And he still acknowledges it and just moves on. And so the moral ambivalence becomes sliding closer and closer to immorality. And the evil is a part of him, not because he won't tell anyone. The evil is a part of him because, thinking the thoughts, saying the words, that would make him the same as Smasher. But the thing is that what makes him the same as Smasher is that he does nothing. He does nothing about it. And the evil is in him now because he's hiding it. And we draw further and further away from his moral ambivalence because he is siding closer and closer towards immorality. And then we go on to see how this is an interesting thing of how he's talking to Sal, and the Aboriginal people are still on his land and they're not leaving, and he's stressed out. And his wife goes, maybe we should move back to Sydney, as I said. And so it's interesting, he goes, how could he bear to go passing in the boat and see some other men there? It would feel like giving up a child. And this is where my argument is that it's ownership. It's the land that draws him to the massacre. It is not his wife. It's not his family. It is this child, the child of his land, that he would feel like he was giving up in order to keep his family safe. And so he's like, I want an easier way, I want a better way, because I'm not giving this up and I'm not giving them up. So how do I do them both? And that comes into, we also see his moral ambivalence come out again here. So I guess I could have reorganized this slide a bit better, but anyway, I'm doing a little bit of order, so 271. So he's kind of also here, it's interesting because there seems nothing to be done except walk back to the boat. And this is also his moral ambivalence. So he just has gone to Darky Creek. He's seen Saggity poison all of them. He's looked at everyone dead and one little boy dying. And his first thing is, okay, I'll get them water. He does do something, But we see this moral ambivalence. We see this ability for him to walk away, to choose immorality. And he's pulled by both sides, but it's the wrong side that wins, because eventually he goes, there's nothing to be done except walk back to the boat. He could have taken that boy to Blackwood. He could have taken that boy and tried to help him or alleviated his pain to some degree, but he chose instead to walk away. And I guess we start to see this cementing of the evil inside of him that is growing more and more. And then we also see this violence coming out again as they come and steal from him, and his reaction to them stealing is now just automatic violence. He goes up to women. He is angry at women, and he grabs them by the hair. He grabbed one woman by the hair and, get off, bugger away, get away, he shouted. And it's just ridiculous to see him behaving in this way, to say that it's okay to be violent, and they're attacking him, and he just punches a woman. And he sees her blood red like his, and he realizes it's the same as his, but he still does it. He still attacks them and bites them and gets his gun ready to shoot them. And here we start to see the evil growing inside of him, that this moral ambivalence is now locked into the immoral side. He is heading there, and there is no going back, we believe. And finally, when they burn his place down, they burn his crops down. They go and burn it, and his wife says, Sal goes, that's it. Well, I'm going. I'm on the first boat back to London. This is it. I'm not staying here. You have a choice. I'm leaving with or without you. And then Sagady gets speared by one of the Aboriginal people, and he dies. And Smasher rallies the men of the area, saying, "Oh, how dare they? We need to avenge his death." But Will knows. He knows it's all stories. He knows that it's not. Sagady kind of deserved to die, really, but what Will does know is that, and this is what Dan, and I haven't talked much about Dan, but he's an interesting character to look at too. Dan comes in and says what he knows, and that is if you kill them, Sal will stay. You'll be able to have both. You'll be able to have it. She will stay. And therefore it becomes, how could he choose between his wife and his place? Making things so that she would stay was worth any price. And that's why he decides to kill them. That's why he decides to participate in the massacre. And it's interesting because up until this moment, he's like a follower, but the moment he decides, he's very much in control and powerful, saying, you talk a word about this and I'll get your tongue and rip it out. That sort of thing of this power comes out of him because he has decided he can't choose. He can't choose between his wife and his place. They are both family to him. They are both important, essential needs. And so he will kill for both. But it's interesting though, because once he's decided to go into the massacre, we still see this moral ambivalence in him. We still see this inability for him to actually know how to interact and behave. So everyone else is fighting around him. And we know he has the ability. We've seen him be able to just, in a rage, violently attack women and children. But instead in the massacre, all we see him do is observe. The whole thing he is observing. He's watching the women get sliced. He's watching the children be stabbed and shot, and he's watching it all. He's watching the spears fly, and it's not until, and he's just got his gun and he's looking around with his gun, and he doesn't shoot it at all until he sees Smasher get stabbed by Whisker Harry's spear. And that's when he finally, the gun was still up on his shoulder, his finger was against the trigger, but he could not move, a man in a dream. So in this moment, he is frozen. And it's interesting, we kind of start to go, why would he be frozen in this moment? So clearly part of his violence is an emotional response. And because he isn't in an emotionally crazed mind at the moment of them taking things, he is struggling to be violent. But finally, he does shoot, and he shoots Whisker Harry, and he thought he must have missed, for Whisker Harry was standing there with a look on his face as if nothing could touch him. And so it's interesting and kind of powerful that he is the one who murders Whisker Harry. He is the one that kills the leader of the clan, of the tribe, and it's his one killing that he does in the whole massacre, and it's kind of as though he doesn't even realize he's done it. He kind of thinks maybe it didn't work, but it did. And Whisker Harry stands there and finally falls down and dies. But and I guess this is a really, and we finish with Smashes obviously dies as well, and there's just this secret again. Violence becomes a secret. They won't tell. No one will tell of what really happened on that river bend that day. But he is feeling guilty, so he's finally achieved all his dreams. He has his land. They've called it Colbenham Hall, and it's there, his everything he dreamed it could be, but it's something missing. And so he tries to atone for his guilt by helping Long Jack, who lives still on his land, and Long Jack doesn't take anything. All the charity that he tries to give to Long Jack as an atonement for his actions, Long Jack just rejects it and says, "Leave me alone." And finally he comes, and Long Jack is touching the land, saying, "This is my place." And it's interesting because this is where William goes, well, but there was an emptiness as he watched Jack's hand caressing the dirt. This was something he did not have, a place that was part of his flesh and spirit. There was no part of the world he would keep coming back to the way Jack did, just to feel it under him. And I find that interesting, to be honest. It feels a little, what's the word? It's just interesting that he doesn't feel like, even though he owns Thornhill Point, he doesn't feel it really is his place. So it's this interesting thing of he spent all this time throughout the novel wanting ownership, and yet even though he owns it, he doesn't feel connected to it. And that connection is something only the Darug people had. And then we finish with him in his morally unable to reconcile his actions to his morals, and so he sits on his bench where he could overlook all his wealth and take his ease, and it should have been the reward. He could not understand why it did not feel like triumph. So he does not understand why, when he sits on his land and he overlooks, like he dreamt so many years ago, what it would be like, he doesn't understand why it doesn't feel like a triumph. But the reader knows. The reader goes, because you acted immorally to get it. You did not respect the people. You did not respect your family. And in doing that, you cannot be triumphant when you take something that's not yours. And so there we see that he is basically, as we said at the beginning, the reader is seen to see him as a victim of the past who perpetuates a cycle of injustice and is unable to live with himself because of it. He's also this lower class confused convict who selfishly seeks security and respect through ownership. But more than that, he is a respectable man, but we eventually despise him because of his morally ambivalent actions. That leads to him massacring innocent people. And so it's an interesting character that she's created. It's an interesting positioning that we feel, because it's not often that they create a character we don't like. Often we read characters and we connect with them in some way, and to some degree we do. We start with that connection with Will, but as he goes on, he makes those immoral choices, and just as he can't live with it, the reader can't live with it. The reader cannot connect with him anymore, and so we find ourselves despising him and rejecting his actions. Okay, so that's a very long analysis of Will, and I hope it really helps you with any essays that you may have to write in regards to The Secret River. All the best. Thanks.